An empire can't survive without walls. If you look closely at the modern religious establishment, you'll notice that their absolute favorite building materials are ripped out verses. Whenever the spiritual agency of a woman is raised, the gatekeepers inevitably retreat behind an exegetical fortress. They pull out the letters of the Apostle Paul, drop them like tear gas to shut down the conversation and declare the debate settled. But what if the entire patriarchal machine isn't built on biblical orthodoxy? What if it's built on a massive psychological double standard that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden? I'm Ellison Keller, and you're listening to The Faithful Citizen. Today, the error of Eden. We're going to expose the psychological grift of the modern church and examine how the establishment misreads the Apostle Paul to enforce the cage of biblical womanhood. Take a deep breath. Let's dive in.
Yeah. Welcome to the space where conviction meets rhythm, where truth got a mic and the church gotta listen. This ain't Sunday talk, it's real life living. Faith in motion, the citizen's mission. We talk grace, we talk justice, we talk peace. Not the kind that conforms, but the kind that frees the world's loud with noise. We cut through the vision, this is the faithful citizen. Let's get to the wisdom.
An empire can't survive without walls, and its favorite building materials are ripped out verses. If you want to understand how the conservative religious establishment maintains its grip on power, you have to look at how it reads the Bible. They don't read the scriptures as a sweeping, unified, and brilliantly subversive revelation of God's redemptive work in history. Instead, they read the Bible like a ransom note. They cut out isolated, disconnected demands from various letters, paste them onto a blank sheet of paper, and hand the congregation a list of non-negotiable terms. We knew this was coming. The moment you suggest that Jesus Christ meant it when he treated women as equal co-heirs, the moment you point out that enforcing the curse of Genesis 3 is a betrayal of the gospel, the gatekeepers retreat behind their walls, and the walls of the patriarchal fortress are built entirely from Pauline proof texts. But what about Paul? The apologists cry, deploying the epistles to the Corinthians and Timothy like tear gas to shut down the conversation. Paul said, "I do not permit a woman to teach." Paul said women must be silent. You're abandoning biblical orthodoxy. They hurl these verses as if they exist in a historical vacuum, completely detached from the chaotic first-century churches to which they were urgently written. To understand exactly how the establishment performs this massive exegetical bait and switch, we have to step outside theology for a moment and look at human psychology. Specifically, we must examine a concept known as the fundamental attribution error. In psychology, the fundamental attribution error, FAE, captures our deep, hypocritical bias in judging human behavior. It works like this. When I make a mistake, I blame my circumstances. But when you make a mistake, I blame your character. If I snap at my kids, it's because I had a stressful day at work, a situational factor. But if you snap at your kids, it's because you're inherently impatient and angry, an ontological factor. We extend grace to ourselves by pointing to the situation, but we condemn others by pointing to their nature. For decades, the Christian church has primarily used the FAE to explain self-righteousness in the pews, but its most devastating application is occurring in the pulpit. The modern patriarchal movement rests entirely on a theological version of the fundamental attribution error. It takes the specific, situational chaos of the first-century church and weaponizes it as a permanent ontological indictment of women's spiritual competency. When the Apostle Paul writes to a church and corrects the men, the establishment correctly interprets it as a situational pastoral rebuke. But when Paul writes to a church and corrects the women, the establishment suddenly changes the rules. They declare that Paul isn't merely addressing a local crisis. He's revealing the feminine spirit's permanent, defective nature. They take a first-century gag order localized in its scope and stretch it into an eternal iron cage. To tear down this exegetical fortress, we have to recognize the psychological grift that holds it together. To do that, we have to go back to where the error first began. We have to look at how the empire reads the Garden of Eden. To understand how the theological establishment misreads the Apostle Paul, we must first examine how it misreads the Garden of Eden. The entire patriarchal grift rests on a psychological double standard, and that double standard was born in the shadows of Genesis 3. To see the architecture of the exegetical fortress, we must examine the original fundamental attribution error. Let's revisit the scene of the crime. When God confronts Adam after the fall, Adam doesn't merely resort to blame shifting. He commits the first instance of the fundamental attribution error in human history. When asked whether he ate from the tree, Adam replies, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit of the tree, and I ate." Adam points directly to his circumstances. He blames his situation. He blames his wife for handing him the fruit, and has the staggering audacity to blame God for the marital arrangement. At no point does he confess a defect in his own character or admit his profound, cowardly passivity. He demands to be judged by his situation, not by his nature. What's truly devastating is that the modern patriarchal establishment read Adam's cowardly situational excuse and adopted it as their official theology. When conservative theologians and podcasters analyze Adam's failure today, they treat it exactly as Adam demanded, a tragic situational lapse. They preach that Adam abdicated his role and say he temporarily dropped the ball by letting his wife take the lead. Crucially, they never argue that Adam's failure proves the masculine spirit is inherently weak, cowardly, or unfit for leadership. They extend immense exegetical grace to men. In their framework, Adam made a situational mistake, but men are still ontologically designed by God to rule the church and the home. But when the establishment turns its gaze to Eve, the grace evaporates completely. When the serpent confronts Eve, she faces an ancient, cosmic evil. She wrestles with the great deceiver of the universe. But when she falls, the patriarchy doesn't see it as a situational failure. They don't say, she was attacked by the most cunning creature in the garden and made a tragic error. Instead, they weaponize her failure as a dark, permanent revelation of her nature. This is the fundamental attribution error in Eve. The establishment claims that her deception proves the feminine spirit is ontologically vulnerable. If you listen to the men guarding the institutional pulpits today, they'll say the quiet part out loud. They argue that women are, by their very design, more easily deceived and emotionally volatile. They preach that a woman's natural inclination toward empathy and inclusion is a liability, claiming that without a man to manage her, her desire for harmony becomes grotesque and even pathological. They explicitly argue that if women are given authority, they'll inevitably tolerate heresy to keep people comfortable. Eve's failure isn't treated as a mistake she made, it's treated as a permanent defect in her identity. They strip away her identity as the Ezer Kenegdo, the fierce, rescuing warrior ally, and replace it with an ontology of liability. Because the establishment believes the female nature is pathological and prone to deception, it's forced to build a theological containment system. The woman must be managed. What does this management look like? The gatekeepers demand that women submit, step back, lower their voices, and adopt a posture of quietness and passivity. But here the mask slips completely, revealing a staggering, terrifying hypocrisy. The architects of the patriarchy will stand in a pulpit and command a woman to be quiet and passive, calling it the beautiful biblical design of God. Yet, in the very same breath, they'll turn to the men and preach that Satan's ultimate goal is to make men quiet and passive like women. They privately view passivity as a satanic vulnerability, the very tool the devil uses to destroy a man's spiritual strength. Don't overlook the absolute cruelty of this paradox. The patriarchal machine demands that women adopt the very posture that men themselves view as a demonic weakness. It forces the daughters of God to take off their armor, assume a posture of vulnerability, hand them over to the enemy, and call it orthodoxy. This psychological grift is the absolute bedrock of the movement, and it's where the trap snaps shut on the rest of the Bible. Because the gatekeepers have already decided in Genesis 3 that women are ontologically defective, they put on a pair of heavily tinted patriarchal glasses before they even open the New Testament. When they arrive at the letters of the Apostle Paul, they don't read them as the brilliant, urgent letters of a pastor trying to manage the chaotic, situational fires of first century church planting. Instead, they read them desperately, looking for proof text to justify their containment strategy. They need Paul to be a warden, not a pastor. Whenever Paul issues a temporary situational gag order to stop a specific local crisis caused by a specific group of women, the establishment strips the verse of its historical context, commits the fundamental attribution error, and declares it a universal, eternal law for all women, everywhere, forever. They take a local fire extinguisher and turn it into an eternal iron cage. This inevitably brings us to a Goliath of the patriarchal fortress, the city of Ephesus in the first letter to Timothy. If the patriarchal fortress has a cornerstone, it's found in the second chapter of the Apostle Paul's first letter to Timothy. That chapter is a Goliath of the modern culture war. Whenever the spiritual competency or executive authority of a woman is raised in conservative circles, the gatekeepers immediately cite 1 Timothy 2:12 to shut down the conversation. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. They present this verse as the ultimate, undeniable, universal law of God. They use it to revoke credentials, fire female ministers, and build an impenetrable ceiling over the daughters of the church. But when you point out that Paul is writing to a specific pastor, managing a specific cultural crisis in a specific city, the establishment scoffs. They mock the idea of examining the historical background of ancient Ephesus. To dismiss the cultural context, they employ the classic ransom note strategy, pointing to just a few lines up to verse 8. I desire then that in every place the men should pray. Look, the gatekeepers declare. Paul says in every place. Therefore, this isn't a localized Ephesian issue. This is a universal, timeless decree for all churches across the globe. This is an astonishing act of exegetical negligence. In the first century, there was no massive, centralized megachurch where all the Christians in a city gathered. The church in Ephesus was a network of dozens of decentralized house churches scattered throughout the city. When Paul says, in every place, he isn't dropping an eternal decree out of the sky onto 21st century North America. He's telling Timothy, in every house church in Ephesus where this specific cultic chaos is tearing the congregation apart, the men need to stop fighting and the women need to stop dominating. To take the text back, we have to put it back exactly where it belongs, in the epicenter of the cult of Artemis. At the time of Paul's letter, the temple of Artemis in Ephesus was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a massive, dominant economic and religious institution. Crucially, the cult of Artemis was a female-dominated religion. The Ephesian mythos was built entirely on female supremacy. According to local legends, the woman was born first and the man was a secondary, subordinate derivative. The cult's central theological claim was that Artemis was the divine savior who would rescue women through the agonizing, dangerous ordeal of childbirth. When Paul plants a church in Ephesus, the new converts are swimming in this cultural water. Wealthy, influential Ephesian women are coming into the house churches, dragging the baggage of the Artemis cult through the doors. They're appearing dressed in the distinctive, ostentatious markers of the Artemis priestesses, elaborately braided hair, gold, pearls, and expensive apparel, which Paul explicitly commands them to stop wearing in verse 9. More disastrously, these women, who have no education in the Hebrew Scriptures or the gospel of grace, are seizing the floor. They're attempting to forcibly subjugate the men according to Ephesian cultural norms, teaching the heresy that women are the superior gender, and that salvation comes through the mother goddess. So, Paul writes to Timothy to help him put out the fire. When Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, he uses a very specific, incredibly rare Greek word for authority. The word is authentian. It appears only once in the entire New Testament, it doesn't mean healthy pastoral leadership. It means to domineer, to usurp violently, or to subjugate forcefully. Paul isn't telling Timothy to permanently ban all women from using their spiritual gifts. He's issuing an emergency injunction to stop these specific, cult-influenced women from violently dominating the men in the room. Furthermore, the Greek phrasing, "I do not permit," is in the present active indicative. A more accurate translation is, "I am not currently permitting." It's a localized, immediate gag order, but the patriarchal establishment's ultimate defense, and their most devastating fundamental attribution error, appears in verses 13 and 14. To counter any argument about Ephesian culture, the gatekeepers point out that Paul appeals to the Garden of Eden. Paul writes, "For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor." The establishment calls this the creation order mandate. They argue that because Paul points to Genesis, he's bypassing culture and establishing an eternal hierarchy baked into creation itself. They cite verse 14 and declare, "See, Paul says Eve was deceived. Therefore, the feminine spirit is permanently, ontologically gullible." But Paul isn't making an ontological claim about the female brain, nor is he establishing an eternal hierarchy. He's doing something far more brilliant, directly dismantling the Ephesian heresy. The Artemis cult taught that women were created first. Paul corrects the historical record. No, Adam was formed first. The Artemis cult taught that the woman was enlightened by the serpent, attaining secret, superior knowledge. Paul forcefully corrects the myth. No, she wasn't enlightened. She was deceived. Paul isn't declaring that all women are universally incompetent. He's setting the historical record straight for uneducated women who are actively peddling cultic lies. Then Paul delivers the final, definitive blow to the Artemis cult in verse 15. "Yet she will be saved through childbearing, if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control." If you read 1 Timothy 2 as a universal theological manual, as the patriarchal establishment does, verse 15 destroys the entire gospel. If women are literally saved from their sins by having babies, the cross of Jesus Christ is entirely useless for half the human race. The establishment has spent centuries performing exhausting exegetical gymnastics to explain away this verse because it utterly shatters their framework. But when you read it in its actual context, it's a breathtaking pastoral comfort. Paul is addressing women terrified of dying in childbirth. They've been taught their whole lives to pray to Artemis to survive the delivery room. Paul urges them to reject the idol. He promises that they don't need the mother goddess. The true God will sustain them through the fiery trial of childbearing if they trust in him. When the conservative establishment takes 1 Timothy 2, strips away the temple of Artemis, mocks its historical context, and weaponizes the text to silence the Ezer Kenegdo, they commit theological malpractice. They take a local fire extinguisher, meant to put out a cultic heresy, and use it to bludgeon the daughters of God. If the first letter to Timothy is a Goliath of the patriarchal fortress, the first letter to the Corinthians is its most heavily guarded labyrinth. When the religious establishment feels its grip on the pulpit slipping, it inevitably retreats to 1 Corinthians 14:34. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission. Read in isolation, as a ransom note ripped from the rest of the text, it seems an absolute devastating muzzle. The gatekeepers point to this verse and declare the debate settled. God has spoken. The female voice has been permanently evicted from the sanctuary. But to arrive at this conclusion, the establishment has to commit an act of staggering exegetical blindness. They have to deliberately ignore the profound paradox found just 3 chapters earlier. Before we can address the silence in chapter 14, we must dismantle the hierarchical framework that the gatekeepers built in chapter 11. In 1 Corinthians 11:3, Paul writes, "But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God." In modern English, the word head almost exclusively denotes authority. The The head of the company is the CEO. The head of the school is the principal. The patriarchal machine leans its entire weight on this English translation, arguing that Paul is establishing a fixed ontological chain of command. God bosses Jesus. Jesus bosses the man, and the man bosses the woman. But Paul wasn't writing in English. He was writing in first century Greek. In Greek, a military general or business executive would establish a chain of command using terms such as archon, ruler, or despotes, master. Paul deliberately avoids those terms. Instead, he uses the Greek word kephale. While kephale literally referred to the anatomical head of a human body, its metaphorical use in the ancient world wasn't boss or chief executive. It meant source or origin, like the head of a river. Paul isn't building a corporate hierarchy. He's making a chronological, theological statement about origins, pointing straight back to the Garden of Eden. In Genesis 2, the woman was drawn from the man. The man was her chronological source. Translating kephale as boss rather than source commits the fundamental attribution error before you even finish the sentence. The establishment assumes that women naturally need a manager, so it reads a hierarchy into the text that Paul deliberately avoided. And we know Paul wasn't establishing a male dictatorship because of what he does next. Just 2 verses later, in 1 Corinthians 11:5, Paul gives specific practical instructions for how a woman should pray and prophesy in the public gathering. Read that again. Paul is laying out the dress code and the cultural parameters for women who are actively and vocally leading the church in prayer and prophetic declaration. In the New Testament context, prophecy isn't fortune-telling. It's the authoritative proclamation of God's word to the congregation. It's the first century equivalent of preaching. You can't prophesy in silence. You can't lead the congregation in corporate prayer with your mouth taped shut. Paul explicitly affirms the vocal, authoritative ministry of the Ezer Kenegdo in the public square. How do we reconcile the vocal prophetesses of chapter 11 with the gag order of chapter 14? Let's set aside the FAE and address the reality of the situation. The church at Corinth wasn't a polite, orderly, modern Sunday service. It was an absolute mess. The Corinthian letters are essentially the Apostle Paul desperately trying to manage a theological frat house. The gatherings were marked by drunkenness at the communion table, vicious factionalism, and chaotic, competitive displays of spiritual gifts. In chapter 14, Paul is dealing with a specific logistical nightmare. The gatherings are so loud and disorderly that no one can hear the gospel. Throughout the chapter, Paul issues 3 separate gag orders to restore order. First, he tells those speaking in tongues to remain silent when there's no interpreter. Second, he tells the prophets to remain silent when someone else receives a revelation. Third, he addresses the women. In the first century Greco-Roman world, women were systematically denied formal education. But in the radical egalitarian space of the early Christian church, women were suddenly invited to sit in the same room as the men and learn the scriptures. However, because they lacked foundational education, they struggled to understand the complex teachings. During the teaching time, they disrupted the service by shouting questions across the room to their husbands. When Paul writes, women should remain silent. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home. He isn't issuing an ontological decree about the female soul. He's acting as a traffic cop. He's saying, stop interrupting the teacher, write your questions down, take them home, and ask your husband to explain the lesson so we can actually get through the service. It was a call for educational logistics, not a permanent spiritual muzzle. Paul was trying to ensure the women could learn without turning the sanctuary into a shouting match. But the patriarchal establishment applies the FAE with surgical precision. They take a situational traffic control directive meant to manage an uneducated, chaotic congregation and weaponize it as proof that the female voice is inherently unfit for the pulpit. To justify their fear of female strength, they're forced to completely silence the prophetesses of chapter 11 to enforce the gag order of chapter 14. They don't care what the text says, they only care about maintaining the cage. When the patriarchal establishment is forced to concede that the gags in Timothy and Corinthians were situational, they inevitably retreat to their last stronghold, the home. They move from the public sanctuary to the private living room, planting their flag on the Ephesian household codes. Fine, they say, perhaps women can speak in church, but in the home, the man is the undisputed head. Wives must submit to their husbands. Ephesians 5:22 settles the matter. But just as with their handling of Timothy and Corinthians, the establishment's use of Ephesians 5 requires a deliberate, surgical mutilation of the text. The grift begins before they even finish reading the paragraph. In fact, it starts by hiding the opening sentence. If you open almost any modern Bible, you will likely see a bold, capitalized heading just above Ephesians 5:22 that reads something like, "Wives and husbands." The Apostle Paul didn't write these headings. They were added centuries later by translators to break up the text. By placing that heading exactly where it is, the translators helped the establishment hide the master key to the entire passage. Verse 21. In the original Greek manuscript, verse 22, "Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands," isn't even a complete sentence. It contains no verb. It depends entirely on the verse that immediately precedes it. And verse 21 is a sweeping, absolute command to the entire congregation. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Paul begins his instructions on the Christian household by establishing a baseline of radical mutual submission. He levels the playing field, but the conservative establishment conveniently ignores verse 21, starts reading at verse 22, and commits the fundamental attribution error once again. They look at the hierarchical structure of the first century Roman household and attribute it to God's eternal ontological character rather than to the situational reality of the Roman Empire. To understand what Paul is doing in Ephesians 5, you have to understand the terrifying reality of the paterfamilias. In the first century Roman Empire, the family was not a warm, egalitarian partnership. It was a strict legal dictatorship. The male head of the household, the paterfamilias, held a legal right known as patria potestas, the power of a father. This wasn't merely the power to make financial decisions, it was the absolute legally sanctioned power of life and death over everyone in his household. A Roman patriarch could legally execute his wife, disown or sell his children into slavery, and murder his servants without facing trial. The empire demanded total, unquestioning subjugation of women. When modern readers encounter Paul telling wives to submit to their husbands, it sounds oppressive. But to a first-century audience, Paul wasn't introducing a new theological burden. He was merely stating the brutal situational reality of Roman law. The threat of death already subjugated wives. The scandal in Ephesians 5 isn't what Paul says to the women. The scandal is what he says to the men. Paul uses the paterfamilias as a Trojan horse. He takes the empire's dominant cultural structure, smuggles the gospel into it, and completely hollows it out from the inside. First, Paul directly addresses the women, the children, and the enslaved people. In the Roman world, these groups were legally considered property and were never addressed as moral agents. By speaking directly to the wives, Paul elevates them from property to active participants in the kingdom. Then Paul turns his attention to the men who hold the power of life and death, and he drops a theological bombshell. He doesn't tell the husbands to rule well. He doesn't tell them to exercise their executive authority with a soft touch. He tells them to die. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. The establishment reads head of the wife and assumes Paul is validating the paterfamilias. They assume he's handing the husband a crown and a gavel. But Paul is handing the husband a cross. How did Christ love the church? He didn't dominate her. He didn't manage her from a corner office. He stripped off his outer garments, wrapped a towel around his waist, washed the filth from his disciples' feet, and then marched to a Roman cross to bleed out for her rescue. Paul confronts the absolute terrifying power of the Roman patriarch and demands that it be violently crucified. He tells the men of Ephesus, whatever power the empire gave you over this woman, you're to sacrifice it for her flourishing immediately. The husband isn't called to be the CEO of the marriage. He's called to be the chief repenter and the first to bleed. The modern patriarchal movement looks at Ephesians 5, strips out the mutual submission of verse 21 and the sacrificial blood of verse 25, and tries to keep the paterfamilias. They take a text designed to violently dismantle earthly hierarchies and weaponize it to rebuild them. They don't want a cruciform marriage in which two equal easers mutually submit to one another in the trenches of real life. They want the Roman Empire, baptized in Christian vocabulary, and they're willing to misread the Apostle Paul to get it. At its core, the patriarchal architecture is a monument to fear. The gatekeepers cling to their isolated proof texts, severing verses from their historical context, because they're terrified of what happens when the exegetical reads the scriptures without a male mediator telling her what she's allowed to see. If you can convince a woman that she's ontologically vulnerable, that her feminine spirit is permanently and uniquely prone to deception, she'll willingly lock herself in the gilded cage. She'll surrender her spiritual and intellectual agency to a man, believing he's her necessary, God-ordained shield against heresy. But if she ever realizes that the Creator designed her as a fierce, rescuing warrior ally, the containment strategy collapses. The establishment protects the curse of Genesis 3 because it's the only way to preserve their earthly power. But the Apostle Paul doesn't leave us trapped in the fracture of Eden, nor does he leave us under the first man's cowardice. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul points us away from the ruined garden and toward the resurrection. He introduces us to the ultimate cure for the curse, the final Adam. The first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, a life-giving spirit. The first Adam stood in the garden, watched the serpent attack his bride, and chose absolute, devastating passivity. When confronted, he committed the fundamental attribution error, blaming his circumstances and his wife to save his own skin. He sacrificed her to protect himself. The final Adam, Jesus Christ, did the exact opposite. He didn't stand by passively while the serpent devoured his bride. He went to war. He didn't blame his circumstances or point an accusing finger at humanity's broken nature. He took the full, crushing weight of our ontological failure upon himself. He stepped into the firing line of the curse and let it break him so he could break it. Christ didn't go to the cross to teach men how to manage the power struggle of Genesis 3 more effectively. He went to the cross to violently reverse it. Don't let the autocrat steal your Bible. When the religious establishment uses Paul to build a patriarchal fortress, it commits theological malpractice. It has taken the letters of a radical first-century church planter who was dismantling the Roman paterfamilias and weaponized them to recreate the very hierarchies Christ died to abolish. We don't have to discard Paul to find our freedom. We have to rescue him from the empire. The institutional church has transformed the sanctuary into a briefing room, demanding submission to an artificial, baptized hierarchy. But you don't have to remain there. If you're exhausted by a religious machine that demands your silence to validate its fragile power, your departure isn't a rebellion against God. It's a righteous escape from a baptized curse. Let the gatekeepers keep their exegetical fortress. Let them guard their empty cages, their localized fire extinguishers, and their ransom note theology. We have a different calling. Step outside the walls. Breathe deeply of fresh air. Morning is breaking in the wilderness, and it's time to build a new table, a table where gifts are recognized by the anointing of the Spirit, not by the gender of the vessel. Let's get to work. The religious establishment wants you to believe that questioning their hierarchy is a rebellion against God. They want you to think that stepping outside the walls of their exegetical fortress means abandoning the truth. But as we've seen today, walking out of that cage isn't rebellion. It's a rescue mission. If you're exhausted by a machine that demands your silence to validate its own fragile power, I want to invite you into the wilderness. There are no gatekeepers out here, just the hard, beautiful work of building a table where every kingdom gift is honored. And the exegetical is finally allowed to speak without asking for permission. If this episode resonated with you, or if you know someone who's currently suffocating under the weight of the fear of Eve, please send this to them. You can find the full written essay for today's episode by visiting the links in the show notes. Thank you for being here and for doing the heavy lifting of reclaiming the text. Until next time, keep your eyes open and keep your faith resilient. I'm Ellison Keller. and this has been The Faithful Citizen.